We're going to start off with the heterogeneity of Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, phenotypes, genotypes, and when you talk about the genotypes showing certain phenotypes, that's actually called an endotype, just bendy. And then I'm going to talk about my miseducation as an immunology specialist, and the cue for me was the discovery or the characterization of periodontal Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. And then we're going to move into, is Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome a non-collagen, non-ECM genetic disorder? Is there an immune issue causing a global connective tissue issue? That's the question. So we already talked about what Ehlers-Danlos do. So faulty connective tissue, faulty brick and mortar, and I would liken, there's two different ways I think things can go wrong. You can either have something broken within the machinery, kind of like that plane that was flying and the door fell off when people were flying, and that's a tragedy, but luckily nobody was hurt. I'll give you an example of a situation where your immune system or your ability to maintain tolerance was ignored, and that was that poor condominium building that collapsed in Miami. Literally, it was poor maintenance over 20 years, and that caused that building to collapse. And I think this is what's happening, is that individuals that have connective tissue issues, you're not equipped with the exposures of modern living. So, faulty tissue in any single organ system. So Sean, I could see it because he was hiving and flushing, but what if that was happening internally, like his gut or his brains or his joints? You can't see that, right? And mast cells, unless you know what you're looking for, they're like ninjas. You have to light them up with specific stains or you won't see it. And the conversation that I have with gastroenterologists all the time is you can't rely on that H&E stain. You actually have to use targeted stains to look at the mast cells. And when they did that in that cohort up in Boston, they showed that the mast cells were not increased in number like you see in eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders. They showed that they upregulated their activation markers. It's kind of like a police officer who keeps their gun out even though the person's been arrested and put away. This is, again, the irregularities that we see in the structure. So to the left, to the right, to the right, is normal tissue. You can see the difference between unaffected collagen fibrils and affected, and lots of different things that can go wrong depending on what's impacted in the collagen, the enzymes that impact the collagen or the extracellular matrix. So again, these are the disorders that Dr. Shapiro had talked about. Most of them are very rare. Periodontal Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome was diagnosed right before the criteria came out in 2017. That is an autosomal dominant inherited disorder. And it is the only one that does not have a gene affecting the collagen or the extracellular matrix. It is a gain of function in the complement system. And complement you can find in sea squirts. Mast cells you can find in sea squirts, frogs, every species you can think of, mammalian versus non-mammalian. And what I find really interesting, some of the work that's coming out of Dr. Tall's lab at Mass General is, at MIT, pardon any representatives from the lab. There are infectious agents that dedicate over 1/5 of their genome to avoid the complement system, which I find fascinating. And so here you have somebody you have these individuals that end up with dental disease. Talk about interacting with the external environment. They manifest with dental disease first, and they have too much complement running around, which will then activate the mast cells. So let's see if there's any tie with HEDS and HSD. So again, this is how they would normally present if they had autosomal dominant, and these are mostly families in Europe. It is gain of function in the complement system, so C1R and C1S will then match up with other complement, form an enzyme, which will then will generate these two metabolites called C3A and C5A, and will directly activate the mast cells. And this is all happening. Unless you know what you're looking for, you will not see it. And so what we find is mast cells sit really close. They sit in the connective tissue. They don't circulate. You won't see them in a complete blood cell count. You have to go into the tissue and see what they're doing and light them up in a certain way. And they are closely related to the nerves and the blood vessels. So they see something, they try to figure out what's going on, dangerous, not dangerous, frenemy, and then if there's enough of a danger signal, kind of like the police officer, you don't want them pulling out their gun because there's a cat in the tree, right? But that's what hypersensitivity is. So now this is happening. You have these very potent chemicals that can chew up tissue, that can change blood flow, that can call in the SWAT team, eosinophils, monocytes, and macrophages, because that's what you want your defenses to do. So let's talk a little bit about tissue homeostasis. So connective tissue mast cells sit right at the surface area. Their job is surveillance, response, and helping with repair after there's been an insult. This was designed to go after infectious agents and dangerous chemicals in the environment that violate the barrier. Once the barrier is violated, this is where you hear about the biome. You now have, if you have a break in your connective tissue linings, you now are set up for organisms to take advantage of that situation. So you want something to get in there quickly and then potentially call in help. But what has happened in the past 50 years? We went from spending 60 to 65% of our time indoors to what? In a car, in a mall, in a store. You better hope that the ventilation systems are up to date in here. So we have spent 90 to 93% of our time in manufactured, man-made. Our materials that we wear completely changed. Our food supplies have completely changed. And we're using genes that our ancestors have been dealing with for millennia upon millennia. So in less than a blink of evolutionary time, you're asking these systems that are made to recognize these dangerous substances to stand down when there's been a violation of the barrier by soap that strips the barrier, chemicals that strip the gastrointestinal lining. And so when you have ongoing insults, the immune system does not stand down. And then you start having tissue remodeling that just doesn't work as well. So the question is, are we having an evidence of neuroimmune-mediated inflammation that is ongoing because you don't tolerate the substances that are in the foods, the clothing that you wear, the air that you breathe, what you eliminate? The fact that we see a huge increase in genital, urinary, and gastrointestinal tumors, this is not just a hypersensitivity issue. This is tissue injury that might even turn into cancer. It is our environment that our bodies, and unfortunately, if you have a connective tissue issue, if you have signs of hypermobility, that is a marker for increased tissue injury. And then the question is, what resources do you have to deal with this perceived injury and then heal the tissue in a way that you can keep moving on? So what we have seen literally in the past 50 years is a huge increase in both immediate and delayed hypersensitivity disorders, meaning mast cell disease and autoimmune disease. Everything's on the rise. Like, I was at Mount Sinai in pediatric GI, and that's the first time in 2000 that I met a 1-year-old that was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. That was unheard of before then. Unheard of. So no different than diabetes. This is all manifestations of tissue injury, and our bodies are trying to do the best they can to deal with these ongoing exposures. So, and this is what I meant by we've had a complete change in our lifestyle. And I'm not the only crazy one out there putting this out. So there are allergy immunology specialists here in the US as well as in Europe pointing to the fact that we've completely changed our environment. And for those that have eaten here and then go to Italy, you ever find that you're able to eat the grains there? Well, guess what Italy doesn't allow? Genetically modified foods. So, mast cells, their job, and the nerves is to act as surveillance. But because we've completely changed what we eat, what we breathe, what we wear, what we eliminate, our immune system and the nervous system are completely off kilter. So just to give you an idea, Immunology 101 very quickly, again, mast cells are found to originate not only in the bone marrow, they're actually seen in the embryonal sac. And they're migrating along with the mast cells, with the nerves, as the body is dividing. They find it in all these mast cells, complement, and nerves are found in all of these species. They have a very intimate relationship, and they participate in defense, inflammation, blood flow, and coagulation issues, as well as reproduction. So here's where this male-female thing might be coming into play. And actually, when it comes to hypersensitivity disorders, at least 1/3 of women going in or out of their menstrual cycle, or girls starting their menses, or women going from having a regular cycle to not, notice an increase in their hypersensitivity issues. So we have plenty of modern insults that are stressing our epithelial borders and barriers, and the result are increased susceptibility to hypersensitivity disorders as well as neoplasia. So let's talk about the diagnosis of mast activation syndrome. I know this is very frustrating for a lot of you. It takes, again, I'm battling with my colleagues all the time. It's really simple. Are your mast cells misbehaving? Are they releasing these chemicals inappropriately? 3 simple things. Do you have signs or symptoms of mast cells misbehaving in at least 2 organ systems? That's syndrome. If it's 1, that's called mast cell activation disorder. That's the only difference. Do you get better with medications that target mast cells in the hypersensitivity well? So checking heparin and taking loratadine makes no sense to me. The purpose of a diagnosis is let me get a therapy in place. So I'm focusing on chemicals that mast cells release that cause hypersensitivity issues, not bleeding issues. I don't check chromogranin A because that has nothing to do with hypersensitivity. I'm trying to figure out whether or not you have a hypersensitivity syndrome or not. And then, after a good story, these are your signs and symptoms, these are the medications or supplements that you're taking. Do I have test results? And here's the thing. I can check tryptase all day long in somebody who's had anaphylaxis to peanut. I will never see it. Does that mean they did not have anaphylaxis? No. That means we need more validated tests to figure out whether or not your mast cells are misbehaving or not. Then once you figure out that the mast cells are misbehaving, you need to figure out why. I don't know what this creature was, but I had a grand time at Sullivan Beach. They wash up on they have mast cells in complement, by the way. But you need to figure out why your mast cells are misbehaving. I would say the majority of individuals, the mast cells are being good police officers. They just got old, bad orders on the books, laws on the books. Like 50 years ago, an African American could not marry a Caucasian in this state. Thank God that law's gone, right? But there's still laws on the books, and the police officer might have the opportunity to use that law inappropriately. So mast cells. Do you have positive allergy tests? That's just one receptor. Do you have an undiagnosed immunodeficiency? Do you have a neuropathy that's not been defined? And by the way, and I think most of the occupational physical therapists here will testify that individuals that have hypermobility issues have proprioceptive issues at the same time. She wants to testify. So, up top is a primary mast cell disorder. It's called systemic mastocytosis, less than 35,000 cases in the state. What's more common is these positive allergy tests, which I can do on a 2-year-old. I can do this on a 1-year-old. But that pathway was used for fighting off parasites, right? But again, do you want a police officer who just relies on a mugshot to figure out whether or not that person with a chainsaw is causing a problem? No. There are other receptors on this mast cell, and this is what we need to find out. As much as we know about T cells, we're not even close to knowing about mast cells because guess what? They're not in the blood. They're not easily accessible. And a lot of people just don't know what mast cells do. Just to give you an idea of all the fun receptors that are on mast cells, you have that Ig receptor. That's what I figure out when I do the skin testing or I do blood testing. I think the biggest receptor that folks in the EDS world need to be concerned about is something called the MERG receptor. This is the one that recognizes vancomycin. This is the one that recognizes fluoroquinolones. And just to let you know, when I was at Brigham as a resident, there was this wonderful fluoroquinolone that was being used by gastroenterologists for infections that got pulled off the market because it caused fulminant liver failure, called trovafloxacin. So no fluoroquinolones. And if you really need vancomycin, You need to talk to an allergy immunology specialist so we can administer that so it's safe. The same thing for pain medications. Guess who has opioid receptors? This is why certain opioids do not work in you, because you're tickling the mast cells, and they're going to release chemicals that cause more inflammation, will interfere with the analgesic effect. And then you have the complement receptors. Again, these cells are designed to recognize complement because complement will then recognize a lot of the pathogens that are trying to set up shop and live in you. Here's the one disorder that really pointed to the fact that an immune issue can cause a global connective tissue issue. These are individuals that have something called hyperalpha-tryptosemia. This is a genetic marker that has been associated with hypermobility, autonomic neuropathy, and mast cell activation disease. This is a gain of function in an enzyme that one of my favorite professors basically says this will chew up anything. This is like a meat tenderizer. This is the type of enzymes that mast cells run around with. These individuals, and this is a genetic test that can be only obtained from one place, but if you don't know to look for it, you won't be able to order it. And by the way, individuals that have HAT in their GI tract, the mast cells are clustered. These are solitary soldiers. They're clustered and they're activated. And individuals that have HAT, when you do transcranial Doppler, they're much more likely to have a lower blood flow to the brain. So again, here we have a tie-in between connective tissue issues, hypermobility, and autonomic dysregulation. So when I first met Sean, this is the paper that I found in Russia. Well, it was translated, thankfully, into English, where they basically went and looked at women and said, did they have evidence of hypermobility? Basically, they did their version of Biden. And then they looked at the mast cells. The mast cells looked normal, except for they upregulated their other enzyme called chymase. And chymase is actually more potent than tryptase. This is the study that I was telling before, where people just came in and said I had mast cell activation disease. And a lot of practitioners do not know how to look for immunodeficiency. So these individuals had not enough protection against strep, even though they got the pneumococcal vaccine. Kids have been routinely administered against that. They had evidence of not enough T cells. Matter of fact, I had 27 individuals that had a T cell count that looked like they had HIV. They had complement deficiencies. So again, not everybody's showing up to the same party with the exposures. And this is another protein in the complement system called mannose binding lectin, which is really interesting for the interstitial cystitis person who are dealing with that. Professor Kular, who's a urologist, he has found that there's a strong correlation with mannose binding lectin deficiency and interstitial cystitis development. And if you don't know to look for it, it ain't there. They don't know what you miss it. And this is the work that's done by the Norris lab, who's showing that there's several components in the complement system that seem to be awry, and again, contributing to this hypermobile phenotype. It's not just the kallikrein receptor. Understand, mast cells and complement need to recognize a plethora of pathogenic insults. So you have to have the ability to profile, and the complement system allows the mast cells to profile for things for usual suspects. And if you don't have those proteins or you have too much of it, guess what? That Goldilocks rule, you'll either end up with recurrent to severe infections or you'll end up with hypersensitivity issues that are chronic. So, wrapping it up, we have genes of the minority of 1 to 1 million that are associated with certain forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome except for hypermobile. Periodontal was linked to a complement issue. My suspicion is it is this combination of exposures in modern living that neuroimmune epithelial axis does not like. So we need to, again, figure out, do you have a primary connective tissue issue? And by the way, I have at least 2 different patients who have collagen issues in the form of either Gaucher's disease or hypophosphatasia. and the mast cells in the nerves are all fried. So again, collagen issue, collagen extracellular matrix issue, a complement issue, and by the way, immunodeficiencies affect 1 out of 2,000, period. So we need to better look for it. It's just that most people have not been trained on it. So we're all talking about stress, inflammation, homeostasis. Stress is much higher. Our sleep patterns are off. Our diet is off. I drink out of glass as much as possible because remember there was a reason why they took away BPA out of those plastic bottles because it was leaching into the water. So we have exposures that are just stripping our barriers, and that is a danger signal to the nerves as well as the mast cells, and that will just link you from an acute inflammatory state to a chronic inflammatory state. This is just to point out there's lots of things available, but I'm not one to give you a therapy and then say vaya con Dios, right? It's really important to get the best set of working diagnoses of what's going on with your nervous system, what's going on with your connective tissue, what's going on with your immune system, because depending on what's going on, we now have a large array of interventions, both pharmacologic and non-pharmacologic, that can help you. And I really have a rule of 5 when I see a doctor or a health or physical therapist, which I need to see soon, as you can tell. Does this person have an idea about what's going on with me? What are they going to give me to help me feel better while they're trying to figure out what's going on? Whatever they give me, I need to warn you about whatever potential side effects. It could be oxygen, it could be wearing a brace, doesn't matter. I need to warn you, and also I need to have some expectations on when you should see benefit and when you might see an adverse event. When are you going to come back so we can talk about the testing that I'm trying to figure out what's going on? And then, are you satisfied with the conversation? If not, you need to move on, because I don't think any of us have time to try to educate somebody who's not willing to learn. I have lots of gratitude, pardon my New York City attitude, but I really lean into that theory about if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. That is a myth. I think if we listen to each other and partner, we will learn new ways to figure out what's going on. And the theory we really should be leaning into, it's wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The original term is if you can't measure it, you can't change it. So if we can figure out better ways of measuring it, then we can then figure out better ways of changing it. I want to thank you for your attention yet again.